Let's dive into the discussions shaping the nation.
I am pleased to have the opportunity to address the Dáil today on the issue of where global trade now stands. It is now obvious that we are facing a trade development that is a major challenge for the global economy right now, and one that casts a very dark shadow over prospects for the economy. Tariffs, to put it simply, are taxes on consumption and investment, and they are bad for economic growth and bad for jobs. In terms of framing last week's announcement, it marks the intensification of a dynamic that has been underway for some time. That global economic activity is becoming increasingly fragmented along political lines. The government's view is that priority must be to de-escalate the current situation and to avoid increasing trade disputes. That said, this is not something the government or even the European Union can fully control. So it's important to take stock of where our economy is at in order to evaluate how well we might absorb this policy-induced shock. This now comes on top of a series of unprecedented shocks to the Irish and global economy. Our economy has proven resilient, and that resilience looks set to be tested again. But this resilience is clear and continued. It's evident in our labour market, where the employment rate has never been higher and the unemployment rate has never been lower. In addition, the inflationary shock has passed, and unlike previous episodes, we are now seeing some signs of the moderation of inflation. I know prices are still high, with the most recent inflation data at 1.8% in the month of March. Having said that, we're very conscious that the price level remains higher than before the pandemic and understand the effect this is having on businesses and on living standards. The strength of the Irish economy is also reflected in the public finances. Last week, Minister Chambers and I published the first Exchequer returns of this year. The data shows year-on-year growth in all main tax headings and an underlying Exchequer balance of nearly €1 billion. This has reflected the government's efforts at running budget surpluses where possible, so that we can respond when needed in more difficult times. While we face into the current challenges, therefore, from a position of strength, it goes almost without saying that we will not become complacent. We cannot. The world is now changing and changing rapidly. It's very likely that the fragmentation of trade along political lines will now interact with other structural challenges that are more long-term in nature. The ageing of populations, the high levels of public debt, and other changes that are underway now with regard to climate change and the rollout of artificial intelligence. So against this backdrop, it's essential that we continue to be careful with how we manage our budgetary policy to respond back to this time of change. With regard to the recent tariff announcements, we are now seeing changes that are historic in nature. Additional tariffs of 50% on Chinese imports to America have been announced, taking the total tariff to over 100%. To state the obvious, this now means that the tax on the import is now higher than the price of the imported Chinese good itself. Overnight, the President has also outlined his intention to introduce further tariffs. All of this will affect the global economy in direct and indirect ways. It will reduce trade between the US and other countries, limiting those countries' ability to increase living standards through mutually beneficial trade, and it will increase prices for people, particularly in the United States, lowering their real incomes. And finally, the reduction in purchasing power across different countries will inhibit their ability to trade with other countries, indirectly impacting trade elsewhere. So the risk is lower trade, lower living standards and lower growth. And that's why, last Ceann Comhairle, all these moves are so deeply regrettable. As the Taoiseach said a moment ago, they trigger lose-lose outcomes. So this is why the European Union and the Government of Ireland is very clear in its message. Through the EU, we stand ready to negotiate with the US administration with regard to tariffs, because we firmly believe that dialogue, that de-escalation is the best path forward. We all hope that this approach can bear fruit and that a more normal trading relationship between the EU and the US can still be restored. However, there's no guarantee of that. And notwithstanding the effect of such negotiations, it is likely that we will not return to the pre-existing rules of trade. International relations and trading patterns have been fundamentally changed, and European countries, including Ireland, must and will adopt. The recent Letta and Draghi reports very comprehensively outlined the work we can do here in Europe to strengthen our own economic foundations and improve our own growth. We must now do this work, at a time of great uncertainty. This represents opportunities for Europe, opportunities for Ireland, and I believe that these challenges can be overcome if we maintain the commitment to working together, to multilateralism that has helped us achieve so much since we joined the European community 5 decades ago. The Irish economy, the European economy, has thrived on cooperation. Mutual respect, trade, and a rules-based economic order still remains here the path to improving living standards. I do believe that the world economy, and I strongly believe that the European economy, can absorb this shock, but only if we adopt, we adjust, and we can prevail with our fundamental values intact and our economies in a stronger position. With regard to the effects on the Irish economy, the government published recent estimates to allow us to better understand the potential impact of tariffs under a range of different scenarios. Depending on the scenario, as well as future countermeasures, modified domestic demand, in other words, measuring the economy, excluding the effects of larger companies, is the best measure of economic growth. And it would be between 1 to 2% below a non-tariff baseline of growth over the coming years. This would be accompanied by a lower than assumed employment growth, which would be around 2 to 3% compared to where we had hoped to be. In other words, employment levels could be around 55,000 to 85,000 jobs lower. This is an important piece of work. It gives our best guide as to where we could be with what we know now. Government must be able to understand the likely channels and the possible economic impact in order to respond as best we can. And this is an important piece, though not the only piece of analysis of this very demanding economic situation. So let me turn to what the government is and will do. We have been a very significant beneficiary of free and open trade and of foreign direct investment. With this in mind, the announcements, as I outlined, will affect our outlook. However, notwithstanding the current uncertainty in the trading environment, companies have very deep roots in Ireland. They have benefited from the very highly skilled workforce and the pro-enterprise environment we offer, still making us a highly competitive prospect for investment. However, we must do better. We must focus on how we can best protect ourselves against the current uncertainty, exploring how we could potentially diversify our trading relationship across the world. We must continue to support the largest employers in the state, and small and medium-sized domestic enterprises up and down the country. We must focus on the factors that are within our control and within our influence. This means investing in human capital, investing in the infrastructure for the future, which I know Minister Chambers will refer to, and it also refers to the funds that we have in place to help us build up safety in our public finances and respond back to the challenges that we are now confronting. We are now in a deeply uncertain period for the international economy, and the implications for Ireland in the coming years are not yet fully clear. The policy decision announced last week marks the end of the many mutually beneficial decades of free trade enjoyed by the US and the EU. The global economy benefited enormously from this trade, with hundreds of millions of people in the least developed economies lifted out of absolute poverty owing to the opportunities created by more trade and deeper integration into the global economy. We are one country that has seen its living standards grow significantly from how we participated in this trading system. At an EU level, two-way trade now amounts to just over €4 billion per day, highlighting the importance of the EU-US economic relationship. We will continue to make the case for free trade and for the benefits it brings for all sides, a case that the Taoiseach, no doubt, is making today. The government is determined to protect our economy, to support and protect jobs, and to keep our public finances safe. We will evaluate the steps that are necessary to do this, but we need to avoid doing anything that could create further difficulties for us down the line. In other words, the actions the government needs to take are ones that also need to be sustainable during this big period of change. This is why we'll continue to engage extensively with all who are affected, building on what has made our economy resilient to recent shocks, while investing to further boost our competitiveness for the next wave of international and domestic investment. Despite the storm clouds that are clearly gathering, I want to emphasise to the House that we are approaching the current challenge from a position of strength, and we will use this to our advantage in the weeks, months and years that await. We have weathered many storms now in recent years. We have done this by working with our partners in the European Union, by managing our public finances in a sensible way, by creating a pro-enterprise economy, and by keeping our economy and our society open to trade. In a very changing world, I'm convinced these elements will continue. Thank you.
Like, share, and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you.